Welcome to War and Peace. War and Peace, Leo Tolstoy's enormous epic novel, is one of the longest books ever written. The noted author Virginia Woolf said, "There is hardly any subject of human experience that is left out of War and Peace." The principal characters are Pierre, a wealthy young man; Prince Andrei, his good friend and an accomplished gentleman; Maria, Andrei's sister; Natasha Rostov, a vibrant young Russian society girl; Nikolai, her brother; Sonia, their cousin; Prince Vasily, a scheming old man; Elena, his beautiful but egotistical daughter; and Anatole, Elena's handsome and corrupt brother. We'll meet others, but these are the primary characters and families whose lives are mingled together in this decade-long epic. The book opens with a Russian society hostess greeting Prince Vasily in French, as was the habit of Russian nobility, and giving her opinion of Napoleon Bonaparte's latest conquests in Italy. She says, "So, Genoa and Lucca are now no more than family estates of the Bonapartes. If you don't say that this means war, if you still permit yourself to condone all the atrocities of this Antichrist, I will have nothing more to do with you." Russian nobility is divided in its opinion about Napoleon. Is he a military genius or an evil dictator? We also know that war is imminent. The hostess goes on to express her high opinion of Russia's Tsar Alexander in relation to Russia's allies, the English. She says, "England, with her commercial spirit, cannot understand the loftiness of the soul of the emperor, who wants nothing for himself but desires everything for the good of the world. I believe only in God and the exalted destiny of our gracious emperor. He will save Europe." Many Russians believe that their Tsar was a spiritual leader as well as a king, and that Russia had a destiny to save the world. Pierre arrives at the party, which is attended by the highest levels of St. Petersburg society. With his heavy build, spectacles, and spontaneous manner, Pierre is in awkward contrast to the polished social scene. Pierre's old friend, Prince Andrei, is there with his pregnant wife, Lisa. Although Lisa is pretty and charming, Andrei finds her and the party superficial. Andrei and Pierre offend the other guests by defending Napoleon. Pierre says that Napoleon saved France from leaderless confusion. In contrast to his hostess, Pierre is one of many Russians who admire the little general, calling him a brilliant military officer. After the party, Andrei and Pierre have a talk about their futures. Andrei suggests that Pierre settle down to a career, but he's enjoying himself a great deal. He lives with Prince Vasily's handsome playboy son Anatole, and they lead a carefree bachelor life. Pierre has no interest in joining the army because, he says, he doesn't want to fight the greatest man in the world, as he calls Napoleon. Andrei admits that he's only going to war to escape boredom. We have a glimpse here of these men's destinies. Andrei has obligations, while Pierre is free to choose his fate. Pierre leaves, and despite a promise to Andrei to reform, joins in a wild party that ends with Pierre and his friends tying a live bear to a policeman and throwing both into a river. We hear about these exploits at a party in the city of Moscow, where the Rostov family celebrates daughter Natasha's name day. Before the Revolution, when the Orthodox Church was powerful in Russia, most children were named after saints. Each saint had a special day of honor, so, in the same way that we celebrate birthdays, a person would celebrate their name day, the day of honor for the saint they're named after. Natasha, her brother Nikolai, and their adopted cousin Sonia hear all the news of St. Petersburg at the party. They find out that Pierre was ordered out of the city because of the bear incident, which is why he's in Moscow and at the party. Natasha's only 13, but she commands attention with her dark, lively appearance. When men monopolize the conversation with talk of war, Natasha loudly asks what dessert is, to everyone's amusement. Feeling very grown up, Natasha asks Pierre to dance. Another romance is in the air. Her brother Nikolai, who's about to go into the army, swears his love to his cousin Sonia. This party is a happy gathering, even though the guests talk about war and the army. There's feasting and dancing in the setting, which is like others we've mentioned so far in the book, wealthy and lively. But the powerful class in Russia was greatly outnumbered by its poor class. This rich society was built on slave-like labor. Servants, often called serfs, were sometimes owned or were paid tiny wages. We go to Prince Andrei's estate, Bald Hills. His father, a retired general, is a crusty and exacting old man. He shares the same name and some characteristics with Tolstoy's grandfather, Nikolai. His daughter Maria prepares for the arrival of her brother Andrei and his pregnant wife Lisa. Andrei is going to leave Lisa at the estate while he goes to war. Maria is a good-hearted person who lets her father harass her through lessons in geometry and algebra every day. She receives a letter from a friend hinting that Maria might be married off to Anatole, Prince Vasili's handsome but wild son. Maria is not particularly interested in being married, but she's willing to, if, as she says, it is ordained by God. Maria is deeply religious, a trait that Tolstoy may have modeled after his mother. When Andrei arrives at his family estate with Lisa, all his father talks about is war. The retired general condemns Napoleon, saying that he's not a great warrior because, for one thing, he's only beaten Germans. His father gives Andrei a letter of commendation to the Russian army's commander-in-chief, General Kutuzov. When they part, the old man shouts, "Go! Go!" instead of giving Andrei a warm goodbye. By October 1805, Andrei is an aide to Kutuzov at the Austrian front along the Danube River, and has access to high levels of information. Kutuzov is not an egotistical leader, and Andrei admires his support and counsel to the other generals. Austria is losing its fight with Napoleon, and Russian aid is needed sooner than Kutuzov expected. The army retreats, burning bridges as it crosses each river. Andrei still sees Napoleon as a genius. While on a diplomatic mission, Andrei discovers that Napoleon has taken a major city. As Andrei rides back to the front, he feels disdain for the Russian forces he sees fleeing from battle. At headquarters, he finds out that 150,000 French troops are coming towards them. He asks Kutuzov to release him to fight. Andrei's new commander feels that he can impose his will and successfully direct affairs in battle, where Kutuzov was more of a supportive manager. Tolstoy uses the different styles of leadership, not to show balance, but to show that leaders whose egos are tied up in their work are less effective. The aging Kutuzov represents Russian leadership at its finest in this book. He has no delusions about military genius. He counts on the spirit of the army and the people to decide the victory. The French and Russian troops are so close to each other as they prepare for another battle that they can hear each other talk. Fighting suddenly starts, and Andrei feels the blood rush to his heart. Then, Tolstoy writes, passing between companies that had been eating gruel and drinking vodka a quarter of an hour earlier, he saw everywhere the same rapid movements of soldiers forming ranks, and he recognized the same quickening he felt in his own heart. But this joy soon passes. The commanders squabble, and there's confusion in the field. This is the first combat for Nikolai, Natasha's brother, who's on another part of the battlefield. Soon after the battle starts, Nikolai is wounded, and his horse shot out from under him. He's standing alone in the woods when he sees the enemy rushing towards him. Nikolai, bleeding and stunned, asks himself in amazement, "Can they be coming to me? To kill me? Me, whom everyone loves?" He pulls out his gun, but instead of firing it, throws it at an advancing Frenchman and runs away. In the army's confused retreat, dead and wounded are left behind. Later, Nikolai revives by a campfire, sadly wondering why he wanted to fight. The scene changes back to another party where Prince Vasily is arranging a marriage between Pierre and Vasily's daughter Elena. Pierre enjoys Elena's beauty, but thinks she's superficial. Prince Vasily also wants to arrange a marriage for his son Anatole. He goes to Andrei's father, the retired general, to suggest that Anatole marry Maria, but the old man has a low opinion of Prince Vasily and his son. However, he allows Anatole and Prince Vasily to visit the family. Maria finds Anatole handsome and starts to respond to his interest in her. One evening, as she plays the clavichord for the guests, she notes Anatole's apparent admiration for her, and thinks this might become a love that's worth devoting her life to. Standing next to Anatole as Maria plays is Maria's French maid and companion, who fantasizes that Anatole is the Russian prince who will take her away from this life of service to Maria. With his eyes on Maria, Anatole gently nudges her maid with his foot. The next morning, Maria's father tells her that it's her decision who she marries, but the old man hints that Anatole is more attracted to her maid than to her. Maria doesn't believe him, but then finds Anatole and her French companion in an embrace. Anatole shrugs as if to pass off the incident, but Maria refuses the marriage offer. She decides to find happiness in self-sacrifice. She feels great sympathy for her maid, and even wants to help her win Anatole's love. Back at the front, Nikolai is among 80,000 troops who parade before the Tsar. When he was within 20 paces, Nikolai could clearly distinguish every feature of the Tsar's handsome, happy, youthful face, writes Tolstoy. Nikolai experienced a feeling of tenderness and ecstasy, such as he had never known before. For a moment during the parade, as Nikolai watches, the Tsar seems to falter. Nikolai thinks to himself, how can the Emperor be uncertain? After the review, the troops' morale soars, and they talk of the victories to come. Nikolai is even more impressed by Tsar Alexander when Alexander shows concern for a wounded soldier and says in French, "What a terrible thing war is." The army prepares for more battle. Tolstoy compares these preparations to an old-fashioned clock that has no life itself and can only move due to actions beyond its control. He writes, "The result of all the complicated human activities of 160,000 Russians and Frenchmen, all the passions, hopes, regrets, humiliations, sufferings, was only the loss of the battle, the so-called battle of the emperors." Tolstoy is telling us that while a battle may be named for a few leaders or a place, the battle itself is decided by the people in it, their interactions and state of mind. Andrei attends a boring council of war where officers present plan after plan. The Russian commander Kutuzov feels the coming battle can't be won, and Andrei doesn't understand why Kutuzov can't say this outright. Andrei says to himself, is it possible that on account of personal and court considerations, tens of thousands of lives and my life must be risked? Andrei goes out into the foggy night and fantasizes about saving the situation. The man who used to be indifferent and cynical about life now burns to succeed on the battlefield. He thinks, if that is what I want, glory, I cannot be blamed for wanting that. Father, sister, wife, I would sacrifice them all for the love of men I do not know. At 9 the next morning, Napoleon stands above a foggy valley and hears the Russian troops enter below him. Tolstoy describes the little emperor. Not a single muscle of his face, which in those days was still thin, moved. His cold face wore that peculiar look of confident happiness that one sees on a boy who is happily in love. When the sun emerged, he drew the glove from his shapely white hand and gave the order for the action to begin. We see how differently Tolstoy viewed Tsar Alexander and Napoleon. The Russians are confused in the fog, then attacked by the French. A bloody battle starts. At one point, Andrei tries to lead an attack and realize his dreams of glory, but he's hit and lies unconscious. The last thing that he sees is the peace and quiet of the sky. Later, the battlefield is quiet with the dead and the wounded. As Andrei comes back to awareness, he hears Napoleon walk by. Napoleon, his hero. Later, his eyes meet Napoleon's as he's taken to the hospital station, and in Napoleon's eyes, Andrei sees the nothingness of greatness. Early the next year, 1806, Nikolai has a leave and goes home to the social life in Moscow. People there blame their defeat on Kutuzov, but more talk centers on the recently married Pierre. His wife Elena is suspected of adultery. Also, everyone believes that Andrei is dead. The once cheerful Pierre is depressed over Elena's flirtations and blames himself for marrying someone he didn't love. He challenges her lover to a pistol duel, his first. He is so unhappy that he doesn't bother to wear his glasses. He's indifferent even to his own life. He just wants to get the duel over with. He wounds his opponent with a lucky shot, gives his wife a large settlement, and leaves for St. Petersburg. Back at Bald Hills, Andrei's wife Lisa goes into labor, with Andrei's loving sister Maria to assist her. At that moment, Andrei returns, recovered from his wounds. Lisa dies after giving birth to a son. Her look of reproach at her husband, he had such contempt for her when she did nothing to him, haunts Andrei. We return to Nikolai's home, where his sister Natasha has grown even more beautiful and is attending her first ball. She's so full of life that she feels love for everyone there. Later that night, Nikolai loses a great deal of money at gambling and comes home guilty and ashamed. He'd promised his debt-ridden father that he wouldn't do this. As Nikolai comes into the house, he hears Natasha singing. Her beautiful voice soothes him. Nikolai's appreciation of Natasha's talent tells us that art is real, while many other things in life, even honor and money, are false. Nikolai leaves for his regiment in Poland 2 weeks later. Now we follow Pierre. After his duel, he was depressed and lost. He meets a wise man who tells him that God can't be found through reason, only by living. The old man, a member of the Freemason Society, tells Pierre that he should join this group. When Pierre does, he's filled with a new sense of peace. He hopes now to find, in Freemasonry, the answers he's been looking for. He decides to read Christian mystic works and spend his time on his estate helping his serfs to improve their lives. A note on Tolstoy's similarity to the three male characters. Like Prince Andrei, Tolstoy fought in the Russian army as an officer and saw the horror and stupidity of war. Like Pierre, he looked for mystical meanings in life and tried to help the peasants on his estate. And, like Nikolai, Tolstoy gambled and led a wild life as a young man. Back to our story. Pierre helps his serfs by educating them and building hospitals, churches, and schools, but they don't trust him. Pierre hasn't the head for management, and he turns his projects over to an unscrupulous assistant who cheats him and thwarts his goals to aid the serfs. But Pierre, seeing the exterior signs of reform as buildings go up, thinks everything is fine. He congratulates himself on his good works and pays a visit to Andrei, whom he hasn't seen in 2 years. Both men have gone through transformations. Pierre thinks that doing good works is the highest achievement and will bring him happiness. Andrei wants to concentrate on his own life. He says that he feels less sorry for the serfs, who at least have the satisfaction of doing honest work, than for their owners, whom he calls morally ravaged. Andrei says he's seen how masters grow callous, and it's those people I pity, for slave ownership makes good men become cruel. Throughout the day they talk, Andrei the cynic and Pierre the optimist. Finally Pierre says, "We must live, we must love, and we must believe not only that we live today on this scrap of earth, but that we have lived and shall live forever there." And he points to the sky, the same sky Andrei found peace in as he lay wounded on the battlefield. And though Andrei says nothing and outwardly continues in the same way, internally a new life begins for him. Meanwhile, Nikolai returns to the front. It's April and the crops are ruined. The army starves, then faces further horrors in June at a fierce battle. Nikolai visits a friend in the hospital, and all around him is, literally, the smell of death and disease. Men are screaming, corpses litter the rooms. Nikolai also sees an historic meeting between Alexander and Napoleon, the signing of a truce. He's shocked when the two men shake hands and treat each other as friends. How, he wonders, can Napoleon act like Alexander's equal? Nikolai had thought of Alexander as a godlike hero. He questions the meaning of war, which everyone seems to forget in this colorful ceremony. Why did we fight? What of the men he saw lying in agony in the hospital? After the truce is a drinking party, and Nikolai denies his confusion by deciding, "Our duty is to fight and not to think." Back in the country, Andrei methodically starts to reform his estates, not as enthusiastically as Pierre, but in a committed way. He remains disillusioned because of his war experiences. His life is basically unhappy. Then, on a visit to the Rostov family estate, he sees the daughter, Natasha. She awakens in Andrei the first joy he's experienced for years. He feels inspired to go to St. Petersburg and present a plan for military reform. It's late summer 1809 when Andrei arrives there and becomes a high-ranking military advisor. Pierre has begun to doubt Freemasonry. Its members were more interested in furthering their business contacts than in Christian mysticism. So Pierre leaves the group and soon gets a letter from his wife Elena asking for a meeting. When they reconcile, he feels a temporary sense of rejuvenation. Some of the action in this part of the book comes from Pierre's diaries and include his dreams. In Pierre's search for meaning, he explores his unconscious as well as his conscious life. Tolstoy also kept diaries, as do other characters in his books. On New Year's Eve of 1810, Natasha Rostov attends her first grand ball. She's spirited and beautiful, and when Prince Andrei sees her, he knows he wants to marry her. He calls at the Rostov home the next day and is deeply touched when he hears Natasha sing, just as her brother Nikolai was in the past. At another party, Pierre notices how Natasha comes to life when Andrei arrives, and he's surprised that he feels a sense of bitterness at this. Andrei's father insists that he and Natasha wait a year to marry. Natasha feels a tremendous love for Andrei. He gives her a sense of stability against her strong emotions. She's upset that they have to wait. During the waiting period, Andrei takes a trip abroad. He doesn't tell Natasha this, but it's for his health. He's grown thinner and weaker, and his doctor recommends that Andrei take an extended rest away from Russia. While Andrei is away, he writes his sister Maria and asks her to see if their father will shorten the waiting time. But the old prince doesn't want to. He says sarcastically that Natasha will make a fine stepmother for Andrei's son by his dead wife, Lisa. Then the old man says that he'll marry Maria's French companion so that Andrei can have a stepmother too. Maria endures her father's sarcasm with compassion. She is the force that keeps the family together. The Rostovs have lost almost all their money. Nikolai comes home on leave to help with family finances. Unfortunately, he has no business skill and gives up, then devotes himself to the sport of hunting. Tolstoy writes 6 chapters describing an exhilarating hunt. Natasha, Nikolai, and others go for a long day in the fields, absorbed in riding and chasing. Their day ends with a dinner and a party at a nearby relative's home, where Natasha dances an exhilarating gypsy dance. Tolstoy asks, when, where, and how had this young countess picked up that manner, those unteachable Russian gestures? Natasha was able to understand all that was in every Russian man and woman. On the ride home, Natasha says, "I shall never again be as at peace as I am now." During the Christmas week, Natasha, her brother Nikolai, and their cousin Sonia talk of the past and the future. Natasha says one evening, "The soul is immortal, you know. So if I am to live forever, I must have lived before, lived for a whole eternity." At that point, Natasha's mother asks her to sing. Natasha starts reluctantly, but as the life in her expresses itself through her voice, all through the house people stop what they're doing to listen. Natasha's mother tearfully says, "Oh, how afraid I am for her," and she thinks that there's too much of something in Natasha for Natasha to ever be happy. Nikolai tells his mother that he wants to marry cousin Sonia, his childhood sweetheart. His mother is cold to this idea because Nikolai needs a wealthy wife to help the family finances. Sonia is torn because she doesn't want to cause any unhappiness. She loves the Rostovs and feels indebted to them. Nikolai returns to the war, having promised Sonia he will marry her. Meanwhile, Pierre's returned to Moscow and resumed his old habits of drinking and gambling. Now he's a society favorite, though at the beginning of the book he was considered odd. Andrei's father and sister Maria are also in Moscow. Maria talks with Pierre at dinner, and she realizes how unhappy she is. Although Maria doesn't say it, her father has become senile and cruel. Maria asks Pierre what kind of person Natasha, her future sister-in-law, is, and Pierre says, "She is fascinating, but what makes her so, I don't know." When Natasha comes to call on her future in-laws, the old prince is ill and Maria acts cold to her. Natasha feels humiliated because she's used to being treated in a loving manner. This is similar to her brother Nikolai's response when he was shot at in battle. He couldn't believe that anyone would want to hurt him. Natasha and Nikolai were raised in loving indulgence and react in surprise to cruelty. Natasha's family attends the opera. She misses Andrei very much. She knows she's beautiful, and that makes her longing for him even stronger. At one moment in the evening, her eyes meet those of the handsome Anatole, brother of Pierre's unfaithful wife, Elena. Elena finds it amusing that the two should be attracted and introduces them. She invites Natasha to a party where Anatole dances with her and tells her that he loves her. Natasha says she's engaged and asks him not to say things like that. But later, when Anatole kisses her, then writes her a passionate letter, Natasha has to face the fact that she's very attracted to him. She feels that her responsiveness is a betrayal to Andrei, and writes Maria a note that she isn't going to marry her brother Andrei. Natasha's cousin Sonia knows that Anatole's not an honorable man, and she prevents Natasha from eloping with him. Pierre finds out about Natasha and Anatole, and he's furious that his wife Elena encouraged the affair, and tells Anatole to leave Moscow. Pierre goes to Natasha and tells her that Anatole was previously married and had no intention of marrying her. The elopement was a trick, so that Anatole could seduce Natasha. She is despondent over her emotional confusion and her loss of Andrei. She tries to poison herself. Andrei arrives in Moscow to find that his engagement is broken and that his former fiancée has tried to commit suicide. He asks Pierre to return Natasha's letters to her and to never speak her name in his presence again. Pierre meets with Natasha, who asks him to beg Andrei's forgiveness. Pierre is deeply moved by this and realizes how deeply he has loved Natasha and for how long, since their first dance many years ago. As Pierre goes home, he sees up in the sky the comet of 1812, a sign of new life to his uplifted heart. That June, war begins between Russia and France. Once again, Tolstoy makes his point that a sequence of coincidences and accidents causes war, not a logical turn of events or an act of personal or national will. The Russian military leader, Kutuzov, takes over command and asks Andrei to join him. As Andrei serves with Kutuzov, we hear many discussions of the theories of war and the planning of the military. But when the battle starts, fate takes over in the form of human action. Nikolai, now promoted to captain, is in combat again. One day on the battlefield, he's riding towards a Frenchman with the same excitement that he felt during the hunt. But when he overcomes his enemy and raises his sword for the kill, he's paralyzed by the fear he sees on the Frenchman's face and cannot kill him. Nikolai is taken prisoner, but ironically he's later given the Cross of St. George because of his courageous attack. Back in Moscow, Natasha slowly recovers. She's found a new devotion to God, and Pierre has found a new devotion to her. When Pierre realizes that Natasha knows he loves her, he stops visiting her. He thinks of joining the army as Napoleon has threatened to conquer the city within months. Tsar Alexander comes to Moscow to rally his people against the oncoming French. When Pierre suggests that the local noblemen should make a plan and present it to the Tsar, he's shouted down. No one's interested in prudence, just in emotion. One evening, people of all classes stand below the Tsar's balcony and call for him. Tsar Alexander, interrupting his dinner, comes out to greet them with a biscuit in his hand. It falls, and the crowd grabs for it. Seeing that, he tosses more biscuits to the crowd, who dearly love their ruler and scramble for anything he's touched. Meanwhile, at Andrei's country estate, his family tries to flee because their home is in the line of battle. The peasants, who are now rent-paying tenants, refuse to help Maria pack up the household. Nikolai, whose company is in the area, finds out and rescues Maria, a romantic situation that they both respond to. Remember, these characters are based on Tolstoy's parents, also named Nikolai and Maria. But Nikolai has promised Sonia he'd marry her, even though the wealthy Maria would be a better match, so the two don't speak to each other of their love. At Kutuzov's headquarters, the old commander listens to elaborate war plans, but uses his instinct to direct the army. Napoleon is approaching Moscow, but a major battle outside the city will take place first. In Moscow, the atmosphere is hysterical. Some people have parties before fleeing the city. Pierre decides to join the army and talks with a doctor on his way to the front. The doctor estimates that the upcoming battle outside Moscow will cause 20,000 casualties. This number staggers Pierre, but he continues towards the front. He wanders into camp and sees Andrei. As they talk, Andrei says that war is unjustifiable murder. The battle the next day, the Battle of Borodino, is a slaughter on both sides. But when the soldiers awake at the beginning of that day, Pierre sees on their faces the latent heat of patriotism that makes them want to fight. For 10 hours, the French and Russians fight. Pierre keeps expecting someone to stop as corpses mount up, but the Russians refuse to retreat, and Napoleon orders that no prisoners be taken. Kutuzov's tactic is to support the spirit of the troops to hold, even when he's told that the battle is lost on all fronts. At one point during the battle, a grenade falls near Andrei. He just stands there, watching it as it explodes, gravely injuring him. By day's end, Russia has lost half her army. Napoleon tries to see victory in the fact that 5 Russians died for every Frenchman. But even though the French had better arms and more troops, they didn't win because the Russian army refused to admit defeat. Tolstoy says that the French were overpowered by the Russians' moral force. Kutuzov makes his next plan. He believes that his job is to protect Russia, not to protect Moscow. He orders the troops to retreat from Borodino to Moscow and then retreat out of Moscow. In the city, Natasha packs up the Rostov home and belongings so that they can escape. As wounded soldiers come into the city, she tries to find room for some of them in their carts. Andrei is among the wounded she takes from Moscow, although Natasha doesn't know it. French soldiers advance on the city, but are disappointed to find not a great capital to conquer, but an empty city. The troops burn Moscow, not out of malice, but because, Tolstoy says, that's to be expected when strangers are lighting fires and smoking pipes in a town of empty wooden buildings. Natasha and her family see Moscow glowing in the distance as they make their way to their country estate. Andrei is delirious and remembering Natasha, but not as he had pictured her in the past, but for the first time he imagined her soul, and he understood her feelings, her sufferings, shame, remorse. Now for the first time he understood all the cruelty of his rejection of her. As he lies there wanting to ask her forgiveness, Natasha appears and they reconcile. After they reach their homes in the country, Sonia releases Nikolai from his promise of marriage. Nikolai is free to marry Andrei's sister Maria. Maria joins Natasha at Andrei's bedside, and the two women become close friends. Andrei views the end of life without fear and dies quietly. Meanwhile, Pierre is captured and condemned to death. He's marched out to a firing line, but then he's unexpectedly saved. Now he finds a new happiness in life, even in prison. Among the other prisoners with Pierre is one of Tolstoy's most interesting characters, the peasant Platon. In Platon we see an idealized Russian, spontaneous, affectionate, given to calling people dear, a strong man who loves everyone equally and is conscious of his being only a small part in a greater universe. Pierre enjoys this man who has the peace of mind that he seeks. Napoleon's troops leave Moscow after 5 weeks. Undisciplined and burdened with loot, they're easy targets for the Russian troops as they slowly make their way out of the city. Napoleon loses 1/3 of his army during the retreat. Militarily, according to the so-called rules of war, the French should have won. They had a tremendous victory at Borodino, destroyed half the Russian army, and occupied the Russian capital. But the French defeat themselves by not reserving winter supplies or attacking the Russians. The retreat begins on October 6th, and Pierre is forced into a march with other prisoners. Although he feels the fear that comes with every human encounter with death and pain, he also feels a freedom in his soul that, he laughs at the thought, no prison can take away. The march continues for 3 horrible weeks. Pierre realizes that there's nothing to be afraid of in the world. The French shoot Pierre's friend Platon when he becomes sick and cannot march. One night Pierre dreams of Platon. He dreams that the most important thing in life is to love life, and that to love life is to love God. The next morning, in one of the Russian guerrilla attacks against the retreating French, Pierre is freed. With the enemy gone, Natasha and Maria return to Moscow. Pierre, recovering there, has a new joy in life that he gained from knowing Platon. He visits Maria and sees a young woman there dressed in black. At first, he doesn't recognize her as Natasha, not until she smiles. Then he and Natasha talk about the things that are most meaningful to them. Andrei and Pierre's experiences after the fall of Moscow. Pierre says to her, "We imagine that as soon as we are torn out of our habitual path, all is over, but it is only the beginning of something new and good." The epic ends with Pierre's proposal to Natasha, within whom, Tolstoy writes, "The life force and the hope of happiness rose to the surface and demanded to be satisfied. She never said a word about the past, and no longer feared to form cheerful plans for the future." In an epilogue to the book, Tolstoy writes of the marriages and children that came from these characters. We see, especially in how Andrei's son Bailisa wants to grow up to be like his admired Uncle Pierre, that life repeats its cycle of learning through the generations and through war or peace.
This is the end of the session.